You won't believe how one man's quiet dinner turned into a movement that shook an entire industry. What started as a single act of defiance became a battle for justice that rallied millions. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The restaurant was warm, its dim lighting casting long shadows over the polished wooden floors. Couples chatted softly at tables adorned with white cloths and flickering candles, while the occasional clink of glasses filled the air with a genteel rhythm. Adrian entered alone, his neatly pressed shirt and tailored slacks speaking of modest success, his demeanor quiet and unassuming. He was here for a simple dinner, an escape from a day heavy with responsibilities. But as he stepped further inside, he noticed a shift, one subtle enough to miss, but unmistakable to those who had felt it before. The waiter who approached him had a crisp uniform and a face frozen in a courteous smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Table for one?" he asked, his tone edged with something hard to place. Adrian nodded, offering a polite smile in return. The waiter's gaze lingered, scanning him from his dark hair to the well-polished shoes that contradicted whatever assumptions he might have formed. Without a word, the man turned and began walking briskly, leading Adrian to a table near the back, close to the kitchen and far from the cozy ambience the rest of the dining room enjoyed. Adrian took his seat without complaint, unfolding his napkin and glancing at the menu. He reminded himself he was here to relax, to savor a quiet meal. Yet, as minutes stretched into an awkward silence, he noticed something peculiar. Waitstaff weaved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of fragrant dishes and fine wine, their faces bright and obliging. None, however, came near his table. Finally, the same waiter returned, his expression flat. "Ready to order?" he asked, as though the act of asking was a burden. Adrian looked up, catching a glint of something in the man's eyes, a flicker of disdain that passed as quickly as it appeared. He placed his order, keeping his tone neutral, hoping to avoid conflict. But even as he did, he felt the unspoken tension growing, the weight of the waiter's unkind gaze pressing against his chest. The meal arrived slower than expected. The plate unceremoniously dropped onto the table with a clatter that startled the neighboring diners. Adrian met the waiter's eyes, searching for an explanation, but the man had already turned away, his shoulders rigid with indifference. Adrian tried to focus on his food, though the unease lingered. His surroundings, once inviting, now felt sharp-edged, the convivial chatter of others a distant hum. When his glass of wine was brought, it was accompanied by an accident that seemed anything but accidental. The waiter, in a swift motion that felt deliberate, tilted the bottle too steeply, and the rich red liquid spilled over the rim, splashing across the crisp white tablecloth and onto Adrian's sleeve. "Oops," the waiter said, his lips curling into a smile that dripped with mockery. "I suppose these things happen." Adrian froze, his breath caught in his throat. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath, diners casting furtive glances his way, before quickly looking down at their plates. He reached for a napkin, his hands trembling slightly, and dabbed at the stain spreading across his arm. "Could you bring me another napkin?" he asked, his voice calm despite the fury simmering beneath. "Fresh out," the waiter replied with a shrug, the smirk still plastered across his face as he sauntered off. Adrian sat back, staring at the wreckage of the table before him. He thought about leaving, standing up and walking out, letting them win. But something stopped him, a determination rooted not in defiance, but in dignity, in the knowledge that he deserved better. His hands clenched in a fist beneath the tablecloth as he resolved to stay. When the waiter returned, it was with a dessert Adrian hadn't ordered. The plate was placed with exaggerated care in front of him. But before Adrian could react, the waiter leaned in, lowering his voice to a venomous whisper. "You people always expect special treatment, don't you?" The words struck like a slap, each syllable carrying the weight of years of silent, buried pain. Adrian's stomach churned, but he refused to let the man see his anger. Instead, he looked up, meeting the waiter's eyes with a steady, piercing gaze. "I'll speak to your manager," he said, his tone firm. The waiter laughed, a low, condescending sound. "Be my guest," he said, gesturing toward the back of the restaurant. As Adrian stood, the room seemed to tilt slightly, the eyes of other diners following his movements. their expressions a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. He walked with measured steps toward the manager's office, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and resolve. But the confrontation was only beginning. Adrian pushed open the door to the manager's office, his breath measured, each step deliberate as he crossed the threshold. The manager, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses perched low on his nose, looked up from his desk. His face held a practiced smile that flickered for only a moment when he saw Adrian. "Good evening," the manager said, standing and extending a hand that Adrian did not take. "Is there a problem?" Adrian's voice was steady, but beneath it, an undercurrent of anger began to pulse. "Yes, there is. Your waiter has been openly disrespectful, spilled wine on me, and insulted me." The manager's brow furrowed as he straightened, adjusting his tie. "I'm sorry to hear that. I assure you, we hold ourselves to the highest standards of service." "What exactly happened?" Adrian detailed the incidents, each word sharp and precise, sparing nothing. He described the waiter's smirk, the venom in his tone, and the audacity of the spilled wine, his voice growing firmer with each sentence. The manager listened, his expression carefully neutral, but Adrian could see the faint flicker of impatience behind his eyes. "Well," the manager said finally, clasping his hands together on the desk, "I apologize if you feel you were mistreated." "If I feel I was mistreated," Adrian interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "There's no if. Your employee was blatantly disrespectful, and it wasn't subtle. I expect action, not empty apologies." The manager sighed, lowering his gaze to his desk. "I'll have a word with him," he said, his tone dismissive. Perhaps he was having a bad day. Adrian leaned forward, planting his hands firmly on the desk, his eyes locked onto the manager's. "A bad day doesn't justify racism," he said, his voice low but intense. "This isn't just about me. It's about what it means when someone like him thinks they can get away with this." The manager shifted uncomfortably under Adrian's gaze. "I'll investigate the matter," he said, fumbling with his words. "If there's been misconduct, we'll address it." "Not good enough," Adrian said, straightening. He looked around the office, taking in the plaques on the walls, the certificates boasting excellence, the photographs of smiling staff. "You don't seem to understand what this represents, what it feels like to sit in your restaurant and be treated as less than human." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the door suddenly creaked open, and the waiter stepped in, his expression smug. "You wanted to see me?" he asked, his voice dripping with insincerity. Adrian turned, his jaw tightening as he faced the man. The manager looked between them, clearly flustered. "This isn't the time." "No, let him stay," Adrian said, his voice sharp. "If we're going to address this, let's do it openly." The waiter leaned against the doorframe, his smirk widening. "Look, I didn't mean to offend," he said, the words hollow. "If the wine spilled, it was an accident." "And the comment?" Adrian shot back. "Was that an accident too?" The waiter's smirk faltered for a moment before returning, now edged with defiance. "I think you're taking this a little too seriously. People like you always do." The room fell silent, the weight of the words sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. Adrian's pulse pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to remain calm, even as every instinct screamed for him to unleash his fury. "People like me," Adrian repeated, his voice soft but laced with steel. "And what exactly do you mean by that?" The waiter hesitated, his bravado flickering as he realized the corner he had backed himself into. Look, it's not like that," he stammered, the smirk slipping away entirely. Adrian stepped closer, his presence commanding the room. "It's exactly like that," he said, his voice rising. "And it's been like that for people like me for far too long." The manager stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice strained. "I'll handle this." Adrian turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "You should have handled it the moment it started. Instead, you let it fester. What happens now is on you." The manager paled, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for words. The waiter, meanwhile, shrank back, his earlier arrogance replaced with visible unease. But Adrian wasn't finished. "This won't end here," he said, his voice ringing with finality. "You may think this is just another complaint, just another angry customer you can placate with a comped meal. but I won't be silenced. Not anymore. He turned and strode toward the door, his steps firm and deliberate, leaving the manager and waiter in stunned silence. The hum of the dining room grew louder as he re-entered, and every pair of eyes turned to him, their curiosity and unease palpable. Adrian stopped in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. To anyone who saw what happened tonight, he said, his voice clear and strong, I hope you remember it. Not for me, but for what it represents. This is what silence enables. Don't be silent. The room held its breath as Adrian exited, the door swinging shut behind him. Outside, the cool night air filled his lungs, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the restaurant. His hands trembled, but not with fear, with purpose. The battle wasn't over, and he wouldn't stop until justice was served. Adrian's steps echoed against the cobblestones as he walked away from the restaurant, the cool night air biting at his cheeks. He paused under the flickering glow of a street lamp, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He hadn't expected the evening to unfold like this, but now that it had, there was no turning back. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers hovering over the screen before he made the call. Rita, he said as soon as the familiar voice answered, his tone steady but edged with urgency. I need your help. Rita, his longtime friend and a tenacious journalist, immediately picked up on the weight in his voice. What happened? She asked, the sound of rustling papers in the background fading as her focus narrowed on him. Adrian recounted the night's events in vivid detail, his words precise and cutting, sparing nothing. Rita listened in silence, her occasional sharp intake of breath the only indication of her rising anger. When he finished, there was a pause before she spoke, her voice low and fierce. They messed with the wrong person, she said. I'll meet you in 20 minutes. Send me the name of the restaurant and any details you can remember. Adrian hung up and took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he typed out the name of the establishment, the waiter's smug expression still etched into his mind. He leaned against the lamppost, his resolve hardening with every passing moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or made to feel small because of the color of their skin or the assumptions of others. 20 minutes later, Rita's car pulled up to the curb, her fiery red hair barely tamed by the loose bun at the nape of her neck. She rolled down the window, her piercing eyes meeting his. Get in. Adrian slid into the passenger seat, the soft hum of the engine a contrast to the tension crackling between them. Rita wasted no time. I'll write the story, she said, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. But we need more. Names, witnesses, evidence. If we're going to expose this, we need to hit hard. Adrian nodded, pulling out his phone again. He scrolled through his contacts, hesitating before dialing a number he hadn't called in years. Hello? Came a deep voice on the other end. Marcus, it's Adrian, he said, his tone cautious. I need a favor. Marcus, a civil rights lawyer known for his relentless pursuit of justice, was silent for a moment before responding. I'm listening. Adrian explained everything, the words tumbling out of him in a rush. When he finished, Marcus let out a low whistle. That's heavy, he said. But you're right to fight this. I'll draft a formal complaint and help you file it. But Adrian, you need to be ready. They'll push back hard. I'm ready, Adrian said, his voice steady. I won't let them get away with this. By the time the car pulled up outside Adrian's apartment, a plan was already forming. Rita would dig into the restaurant's history, searching for patterns of misconduct, while Marcus would begin gathering the legal documentation needed to hold them accountable. Adrian, meanwhile, would reach out to the diners who had witnessed the events, hoping that someone would be willing to speak out. As the night deepened, Adrian sat at his kitchen table, his laptop open and a notepad beside it. He scrolled through social media, typing out a carefully worded post describing his experience. He hesitated for only a moment before hitting publish, the words launching into the digital ether. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in, a mix of outrage, support, and shock. Stories from others began to surface, each one echoing his own in painful familiarity. By morning, the post had gone viral, the restaurant's name trending alongside hashtags demanding accountability. Adrian's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, reporters clamoring for interviews, strangers offering their solidarity. But amidst the chaos, one message stood out, a private note from an employee at the restaurant. "I saw what happened," it read. "I've worked there for 3 years and I've seen it before. If you need someone to back you up, I'm here." Adrian's heart raced as he read the message, his determination solidifying. This wasn't just about his fight anymore. It was about exposing a pattern, holding not just individuals but an entire system accountable. He replied immediately, setting up a meeting for later that day. As he closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, exhaustion began to creep in, but he pushed it aside. There was too much at stake to rest now. By the time the sun set again, Adrian found himself sitting across from the anonymous employee in a quiet coffee shop. The man, a young waiter with tired eyes and a nervous demeanor, recounted stories of prejudice and mistreatment he'd witnessed over the years, his voice trembling but resolute. Adrian listened intently, his mind racing with possibilities. The pieces were falling into place, and the momentum was building. But he knew this was only the beginning. The battle ahead would be long and grueling, but he was ready. The truth, once buried, was beginning to surface, and Adrian was determined to see it through to the end. Adrian leaned forward, his coffee untouched, the cup growing cold as the young waiter, Jordan, recounted his stories. Each word painted a darker picture of the restaurant's toxic environment. Jordan's voice was low, his eyes darting around the room as though someone might be listening, but the weight of his words struck with the force of a hammer. "They think no one will speak out," Jordan said, his hands clutching the edge of the table. "The manager, the head chef, even some of the regular staff, they all cover for each other. It's this unspoken code. If you push back, they find ways to force you out. It's why so many people quit after a few months. The ones who stay," he hesitated, his lips tightening. "The ones who stay learn to look the other way." Adrian's fists clenched under the table, his knuckles white. "And no one's ever done anything? No complaints, no investigations?" Jordan shook his head. "People are scared. Most of us need the paycheck. And even when someone does speak up, they bury it. The management has connections, enough to make trouble disappear." Adrian leaned back, the frustration in his chest threatening to choke him. "Not this time," he said, his voice steady but edged with fire. "This time, they're going to face consequences." Jordan looked up at him, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "What do you need from me?" Adrian hesitated. He could see the fear in Jordan's eyes, the years of silence weighing on him. Asking him to come forward publicly would put him at risk, but without witnesses, the case would be harder to fight. "I need your testimony," Adrian said finally. "I know it's asking a lot, but your voice could make all the difference." Jordan swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his hands. The silence stretched between them, heavy and fraught. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it. I'm tired of feeling helpless." Adrian placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, his grip firm. "You're not alone in this. We're going to fight back." The following days were a blur of strategy and action. Rita worked tirelessly, uncovering records of past complaints and tracking down former employees. Many were hesitant to speak, their fear of retaliation still fresh despite having left the toxic environment. But some, emboldened by Adrian's story, began to share their own experiences. Their accounts painted a damning picture, a pattern of discrimination, verbal abuse, and targeted harassment that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Marcus, meanwhile, prepared the legal groundwork, drafting a formal lawsuit against the restaurant. "We're building a case not just for you," he told Adrian during one of their late-night calls, "but for every person they've hurt. This isn't just about compensation, it's about dismantling their entire system." The media frenzy grew with each passing day. Adrian found himself in the spotlight, his story spreading across news outlets and social media platforms. The restaurant's management released a tepid statement, denying the allegations and dismissing Adrian's claims as misunderstandings blown out of proportion. But their efforts to control the narrative only fueled the fire. Former employees began coming forward publicly, their voices joining a growing chorus demanding accountability. Then, one evening, as Adrian prepared for a televised interview, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his voice cautious. Hello. A low, familiar voice crackled through the line. You think you're some kind of hero? Adrian's stomach tightened. It was the waiter, his tone dripping with menace. You have no idea who you're messing with. People like you don't win these fights. Adrian's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. You've already lost, he said. Every word you've said, every action you've taken, is coming to light, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The line went dead, but Adrian didn't let the threat shake him. If anything, it fueled his resolve. The day of the lawsuit filing, Adrian, Rita, Marcus, and a small group of former employees gathered on the courthouse steps. A crowd of reporters and supporters waited, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every moment. Adrian stepped forward, his voice strong and unwavering as he addressed them. This is not just my fight, he said, his words ringing with conviction. This is about justice for everyone who has been silenced, everyone who has been made to feel less than human. We will not stop until accountability is served. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy electric. But as Adrian scanned the faces before him, he knew the battle was far from over. The restaurant's management would fight back, using every resource at their disposal to protect their reputation. The threats would continue, the resistance would grow stronger, and the path ahead would be steep. But Adrian was ready. This fight wasn't just about a single night at a restaurant. It was about a lifetime of prejudice and a determination to confront it head-on. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. And he would not stop until the truth shattered every wall of silence that tried to contain it. As the reporters dispersed, their questions still echoing in Adrian's ears, he felt the weight of what had just begun settle on his shoulders. Marcus clapped a hand on his back, a silent gesture of support, before stepping away to take a call. Adrian stayed rooted to the courthouse steps, his gaze drifting to the sky as if seeking clarity from the endless expanse above. The sunlight felt too sharp, the day too loud, and yet a quiet storm brewed in his chest. Later that evening, he sat in his apartment, his laptop open on the kitchen table, the glow from the screen casting harsh shadows across the room. Rita's latest draft was on display, a meticulous exposé that spared no detail, weaving together testimony after testimony from former employees, diners, and even a few reluctant staff members still working at the restaurant. Each account layered upon the next, painting an irrefutable picture of systemic discrimination and unchecked abuse. Adrian scrolled through the document, his eyes heavy but his focus sharp. As he reached the end, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was Jordan. Adrian, Jordan said, his voice shaky. Something happened. What is it? Adrian asked, sitting up straighter, his heart pounding. They fired me, Jordan said, his words tumbling out in a rush. The manager called me into his office this afternoon. He said my attitude wasn't a good fit anymore, and that my services were no longer needed. They didn't even let me finish my shift. Just told me to pack my things and leave. Adrian gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. That's retaliation. They're trying to intimidate you. Jordan's voice cracked. I don't know what to do. I need this job. I have rent to pay. You're not alone in this, Adrian said firmly, cutting through Jordan's panic. We'll make sure this becomes part of the case. It's proof of exactly what we're fighting against. But they're ruthless, Jordan whispered. What if it gets worse? Adrian's throat tightened, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. It might, but we're not backing down. Every time they push, we push harder. Trust me, Jordan, you're not fighting this alone. After hanging up, Adrian sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Jordan's fear pressing on him. The stakes were climbing, and with every move he made, the opposition grew bolder, their tactics more insidious. He thought back to the waiter's voice on the phone, the thinly veiled threat, and wondered what else they might try. That night, he barely slept. When he finally drifted into an uneasy slumber, his dreams were filled with fragmented images. Jordan's anxious face, the manager's cold smirk, the clinking of glasses in the restaurant as judgmental eyes followed his every move. By morning, another storm was brewing. Rita had published the exposé, and it had already begun to spread like wildfire. Social media lit up with outrage, calls for boycotts, and demands for justice. But amid the flood of support, there was also resistance. Anonymous accounts sprang up, accusing Adrian of fabricating his story, smearing his character with baseless claims. The restaurant's management released another statement, this one more aggressive, calling the allegations a malicious attempt to tarnish the reputation of a beloved establishment. Adrian read the statement over breakfast, his stomach churning as he scrolled through the carefully crafted lies. He knew this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. He pushed his plate aside, no longer hungry, and picked up his phone. "Marcus," he said when the lawyer answered. "They're doubling down." "I saw it," Marcus replied, his tone grim. "It's exactly what I expected. This isn't just about defending themselves. It's about dragging you down, discrediting you so thoroughly that no one will listen to what you have to say." Adrian exhaled sharply. "So, what's the plan?" "The plan," Marcus said, "is to keep going. Every lie they tell, we counter it with the truth. Every move they make, we use it to strengthen our case. And we don't stop until we win." The fire in Marcus's voice reignited Adrian's resolve. He hung up and immediately dove back into the fight, coordinating with Rita, reaching out to witnesses, and building a network of allies who believed in the cause. As the days stretched into weeks, the battle raged on. The restaurant's legal team filed countersuits, accusing Adrian of defamation and seeking damages for the supposed harm to their reputation. Anonymous threats escalated, the messages becoming more personal, more invasive. Adrian's own past was dragged into the spotlight, every misstep and mistake twisted and magnified to undermine his credibility. Yet, through it all, the movement only grew. More employees came forward, their stories adding weight to the mounting evidence. Activists and advocacy groups rallied around Adrian, amplifying his voice and turning the fight into a broader conversation about discrimination in the service industry. The restaurant began to falter under the pressure. Diners canceled reservations, their once busy dining room now half empty even on weekends. Investors pulled out, distancing themselves from the scandal. And then, finally, the first crack appeared. An email leaked, an internal memo from the restaurant's management instructing staff to handle certain customers with care, thinly veiled language that pointed directly to racial profiling. When Adrian saw the email, he felt a flicker of triumph. It wasn't just his word against theirs anymore. The proof was there, undeniable and damning. But the fight was far from over. As he prepared for the next court hearing, Adrian knew the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about holding one restaurant accountable. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that silence could be shattered, that no system of injustice was untouchable. The battle continued, fierce and relentless, and Adrian stood in the eye of the storm, unyielding. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators filled every available seat, and even the corners of the room were lined with people standing shoulder to shoulder, eager to witness the proceedings. Adrian sat at the plaintiff's table, his suit crisp, his hands folded tightly on the polished surface before him. To his right, Marcus shuffled through a thick stack of documents, his expression calm but steely, like a general preparing for battle. Across the aisle sat the restaurant's defense team, 3 lawyers in sleek, dark suits, their faces impassive but eyes sharp, calculating. The manager was there too, his demeanor subdued but his body language betraying his unease as he whispered nervously to his attorneys. Adrian felt the weight of every eye on him. Some were filled with support, others with skepticism, but all were waiting to see how this would unfold. The stakes had grown beyond anything he could have imagined when he first stepped into that restaurant. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a public reckoning, one that had rippled far beyond his own experience. The judge entered, a solemn figure in black robes, her presence commanding the room to fall silent. As the trial began, the opening statements painted the battle lines clearly. The defense tried to frame Adrian's accusations as exaggerated, claiming his account was a result of misunderstanding and miscommunication. Their words were polished, their tone measured, but Adrian could see through the facade. They were buying time, laying traps, waiting to pick apart his credibility. Marcus stood next, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "This case is not about misunderstanding," he began, his tone deliberate and resonant. "This case is about a culture of discrimination, a system designed to silence and exclude, and the courage of one man who refused to stay silent. The first witnesses were called, former employees who had come forward with stories eerily similar to Adrian's. One by one, they described the toxic environment, the way complaints were dismissed, the unspoken rules that ensured only certain patrons were treated with dignity. Jordan was among them, his voice trembling as he recounted not just the retaliation he'd faced, but the years of casual racism he had endured in silence. Each testimony landed like a hammer blow, the weight of their words making the defense squirm. Then it was Adrian's turn. As he took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus guided him through his testimony, his questions precise, drawing out every detail of the night in question. Adrian spoke with clarity, his voice steady even as he described the humiliation, the taunts, the deliberate acts meant to dehumanize him. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. He didn't need to. The truth was sharp enough to cut through any doubt. When the defense's turn came, they wasted no time going on the offensive. The lead attorney rose, a tall woman with a piercing gaze and a voice as smooth as glass. She questioned Adrian relentlessly, trying to trip him up, to paint him as overly sensitive, as someone looking for a fight where there was none. "Mr. Banks," she said, her tone cold and calculated, "is it possible that you misinterpreted the waiter's actions? That his behavior, while perhaps less than courteous, wasn't rooted in any form of prejudice?" Adrian held her gaze, refusing to flinch. "No," he said firmly. "It wasn't a misinterpretation. His words, his tone, his actions, everything about that night was deliberate." The attorney leaned closer, her expression sharpening. "You're asking this court to believe that an entire staff, including the manager, conspired to single you out. Doesn't that seem implausible?" Adrian's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What's implausible," he said, "is that people like me are expected to endure this kind of treatment without speaking out. This isn't about a conspiracy. It's about a pattern, one that's been ignored for too long." The attorney opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Marcus stood. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "Sustained," the judge said, her gaze narrowing at the defense. The attorney stepped back, her frustration visible in the tight set of her jaw. As Adrian stepped down from the stand, he felt the tension in the room shift. The defense was on the back foot, their carefully constructed narrative unraveling under the weight of the evidence and testimony. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The turning point came 3 days later, when Rita unveiled a bombshell, an audio recording from a former employee who had secretly documented a staff meeting. In the recording, the manager's voice was unmistakable as he instructed the staff to prioritize certain customers over others, to keep the image of the restaurant intact. The implication was clear, the bias undeniable. The courtroom erupted when the recording was played, gasps and murmurs rippling through the crowd. The defense scrambled, their polished composure cracking as they tried to dismiss the recording as irrelevant. But the damage was done. The judge called for order, her gavel striking the bench sharply, but the momentum was firmly in Adrian's favor. As the trial neared its conclusion, Adrian sat in the courtroom, his heart heavy but hopeful. He had done everything he could, laid bare every truth, and faced every attempt to discredit him. The rest was out of his hands now. When the jury finally delivered their verdict, the room seemed to freeze. The foreperson stood, her expression solemn as she read the words that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Adrian Banks." The words hit Adrian like a tidal wave, the relief and vindication overwhelming him. He glanced at Marcus, who nodded once, a faint but satisfied smile breaking through his stoic demeanor. The restaurant's representatives sat frozen, their defeat written across their faces. The manager stared straight ahead, his expression blank, his carefully constructed empire crumbling around him. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled, their cheers erupting as Adrian stepped into the sunlight. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward him, but he didn't rush to speak. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the faces of those who had supported him, the countless voices that had joined his fight. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying over the noise. "This isn't just a victory for me," he said. "It's a victory for everyone who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel like they didn't belong. This is proof that the truth matters, that justice is possible, and that when we stand together, we can change the world. The crowd erupted again, their cheers a symphony of hope and determination. But even as Adrian stood there, basking in the moment, he knew the fight wasn't over. This was just one battle in a war that was far from finished, and he was ready for whatever came next. As Adrian stood amidst the roaring crowd outside the courthouse, the magnitude of the moment began to settle in. This wasn't just his victory. It was a ripple, one that he hoped would spread far beyond this single case. But even as the reporters pressed forward with their questions and supporters cheered, a gnawing feeling of unfinished business clawed at him. The verdict was only one step in dismantling the rot that had festered in places like the restaurant. The question remained, what next? Later that evening, Adrian found himself back in his apartment, the hum of the city muted through his closed windows. His phone buzzed relentlessly, messages of congratulations, invitations for interviews, calls from strangers pouring their gratitude into voicemails. But amidst the flood of support, there were darker messages too. Anonymous numbers threatening retaliation, emails filled with slurs and vitriol, attempts to drown his triumph in hatred. He stared at his phone, the screen glowing in the dimly lit room, and a wave of exhaustion washed over him. He had won, but at what cost? Every step forward seemed to reveal a new battleground, a new enemy eager to silence him. The weight of the fight pressed heavy on his chest, but he refused to let it crush him. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next morning, Adrian sat across from Rita and Marcus at a small cafe. The three of them huddled around a table strewn with papers and laptops. Rita's fiery energy was undimmed, her fingers flying over her keyboard as she pieced together the next chapter of their strategy. Marcus, ever methodical, flipped through legal documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We've opened the floodgates," Rita said, barely looking up. "I've already got 10 more people reaching out, sharing their stories. It's not just this restaurant, it's the whole industry. This case has put them on notice, but if we stop now, they'll go back to business as usual." Adrian nodded, his jaw set. "Then we don't stop. We go after the root of it." Marcus looked up, his expression cautious. "That's a much bigger fight, Adrian. We're talking systemic change. You're going to need more than just a handful of lawsuits and exposés. You'll need allies, funding, a coordinated effort." Adrian leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "Then we build it. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they didn't matter. We have the momentum. We can't let it slip away." Rita grinned, her eyes sparking with excitement. "I like the sound of that. We start with the restaurants, but we don't stop there. Hotels, retail, transportation, anywhere this kind of behavior thrives. We make noise until they can't ignore us." For weeks, they worked tirelessly, assembling a coalition of activists, lawyers, and journalists. Adrian poured every ounce of his energy into the movement, speaking at rallies, meeting with lawmakers, and amplifying the voices of those who had been silenced. Each story they uncovered added fuel to the fire. A host is fired for refusing to follow discriminatory seating policies. A busboy harassed until he quit. A family denied service under the guise of a dress code. But the opposition grew fiercer. Adrian's inbox filled with threats, his address was leaked online, and protesters began appearing outside his apartment, their chants echoing up through his windows. One night, a brick shattered his front window, the glass scattering across the floor like jagged stars. Adrian stood in the wreckage, his hands trembling as he stared at the spray-painted words on the wall. "Know your place." He called Marcus, his voice taut with anger. "This isn't just resistance. It's a warning." Marcus sighed heavily on the other end of the line. "You're pushing against a system that's been in place for decades, Adrian. They're scared, and this is how they lash out. But you can't let them win." Adrian clenched his fists, the words on the wall seared into his mind. "I won't. If they think this will scare me off, they don't know who they're dealing with." The next morning, Adrian released a public statement, accompanied by a photo of the vandalized wall. "This is the cost of standing up," he wrote. "But I will not back down. To anyone who has ever faced this kind of hatred, you are not alone. Together, we will rise, The post went viral within hours, sparking a wave of solidarity. People across the country began sharing their own stories, tagging Adrian in posts that demanded accountability and justice. The movement grew, a groundswell of voices refusing to be silenced. But with each victory came a new challenge. Major corporations began issuing statements of support, but Adrian knew their words were hollow unless backed by action. He called out their performative allyship in interviews, challenging them to enact real change within their organizations. Some bristled at his demands, but others began to listen, pledging resources to the cause. As the months turned into a year, Adrian found himself standing before a crowd of thousands at a rally in Washington, D.C. The National Mall stretched out before him, a sea of faces united in their determination. Behind him, Rita and Marcus stood as silent pillars of support, their presence a reminder of how far they had come. Adrian stepped up to the microphone, his heart pounding as he looked out at the crowd. "This fight began in a restaurant," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "But it was never just about one place, one night, or one person. It's about a system that has thrived on silence and complicity. It's about saying, 'No more.'" The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a thunderous wave that crashed over him. Adrian paused, letting their energy fill him before continuing. "We have seen what happens when we stand together. We've seen what happens when we refuse to back down. And we are not finished. Not until every person, no matter their race, their background, their appearance, can walk into any space and be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The cheers grew deafening, a roar of hope and defiance that echoed through the city. Adrian stepped back from the microphone, his chest heaving, his heart full. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, he knew they were unstoppable. As Adrian stepped off the stage, the cheers from the crowd still reverberating in his ears, he felt a hand clasp his shoulder. It was Marcus, his normally stoic expression softened by a rare smile. "That was powerful," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "You've ignited something bigger than any of us imagined." Adrian nodded, his breath still heavy from the speech. "It's not just me. It's everyone who's spoken out, who's stood up, who's refused to be silenced. This is their fight too." Rita approached, her phone in hand, a fire in her eyes. "Adrian, you need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. She handed him the phone, the screen glowing with an incoming notification. Adrian squinted at the headline, his stomach twisting as he read it. Major restaurant chain CEO denounces movement, calls allegations a smear campaign. Below it, a quote from the CEO claimed that Adrian's movement was stirring unnecessary division and damaging the livelihoods of hardworking restaurant employees. He handed the phone back, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to flip the narrative," he said, his voice hard. "Make us look like the aggressors." "Of course they are," Rita said, sliding her phone into her pocket. "They're losing control, and this is their desperate attempt to regain it. But we won't let them." Marcus adjusted his tie, his expression turning serious. "This isn't just PR spin anymore. They're going to escalate, Adrian. They've got money, influence, and connections. If we're not careful, they'll use every tool they have to discredit us." Adrian clenched his fists, the memory of the threats, the vandalism, and the ceaseless attacks flooding his mind. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of determination. "Then we hit back harder," he said. "We keep the focus on the truth, on the stories of the people they've hurt. They can't erase what's already out there." That night, back at his apartment, Adrian worked late into the hours of the morning, combing through documents, responding to messages from supporters, and coordinating with Rita and Marcus. Every hour brought new developments. Leaks from within corporations, emails from whistleblowers, and stories from victims who had suffered in silence for years. The movement had grown beyond anything he'd imagined, and now it was like an unstoppable wave, crashing against the carefully constructed walls of the powerful. But with the momentum came the costs. Adrian's personal life began to unravel under the pressure. Friends who didn't want to be associated with the controversy quietly distanced themselves. His family, once supportive, grew uneasy with the intensity of the backlash. His mother called one evening, her voice trembling. "Adrian, I'm proud of you," she said, "but I'm scared too." These people you're up against, they don't fight fair." "I know, Mom," Adrian replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But I can't stop now. This fight is too important." Days turned into weeks, each one a new battlefield. The opposing forces mounted smear campaigns, planting stories in the media that painted Adrian as an opportunist and the movement as a chaotic mob. Social media became a war zone, with trolls flooding his posts, twisting his words, and spreading lies. Then, one evening, the situation escalated again. Adrian was walking home after a late meeting when a black SUV pulled up alongside him. The window rolled down, and a man in a tailored suit leaned out. "Mr. Banks," he said, his tone smooth but menacing. "A word of advice. This isn't a fight you can win. Walk away while you still can." Adrian stopped, his pulse quickening, but he stood his ground. "Is that a threat?" The man smiled faintly. "Just a suggestion. You've made your point. No need to take this any further. Otherwise," he let the sentence hang in the air before rolling the window up and driving away. Adrian stood on the sidewalk, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Fear curled at the edges of his resolve, but he pushed it down. He had known from the beginning that this fight would come with risks, and he wasn't about to let them intimidate him into silence. The next morning, Adrian went public with the encounter, posting a detailed account of the SUV and the man's veiled threat. The response was explosive. His supporters rallied around him, their outrage turning into fuel for the movement. "They're scared of you, Adrian," Rita said during a call. "That's why they're doing this. They know they're losing." But Adrian knew that fear alone wasn't enough to bring about real change. They needed something bigger, something undeniable, to force the institutions to bend. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, in the form of a document leaked by a whistleblower within one of the major restaurant corporations. It was a training manual, one that explicitly outlined discriminatory practices disguised as customer preference strategies. The language was clinical, detached, but its implications were damning. Adrian stared at the file on his screen, his heart pounding. This was the smoking gun they'd been waiting for. He immediately forwarded it to Rita, his fingers trembling as he typed. "This changes everything." Within hours, the story broke, and the backlash was swift and unrelenting. The corporations named in the manual scrambled to respond, their PR teams issuing frantic statements of denial and promising internal investigations. But the damage was done. Protests erupted across the country, boycotts gained traction, and lawmakers began calling for hearings to address the systemic issues the manual exposed. Adrian found himself at the center of it all, his name becoming a symbol for the fight against injustice. But as he stood on the precipice of a revolution, he knew the hardest battles were still ahead. The institutions they were challenging were vast, deeply entrenched, and ruthless in their defense. The fight was far from over, but Adrian was ready. This was no longer just a movement, it was a reckoning, and he would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. Adrian barely slept in the days that followed the leak. His phone buzzed constantly, his inbox flooded with emails, some offering solidarity, others laced with venom. The manual had set off a firestorm, igniting protests and drawing widespread condemnation from every corner of the country. But the pushback was relentless. Lawyers for the implicated corporations filed injunctions, demanding that the document be removed from public view. Media outlets debated his credibility, some questioning his motives while others hailed him as a hero. Late one night, as Adrian sat at his cluttered kitchen table, his head resting heavily in his hands, Rita called. Her voice, usually quick and full of determination, was strained. "Adrian, you're going to want to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting," he said, bracing himself. "What now?" "They've gone nuclear," she said. "One of the corporations just announced they're suing you for defamation. They're claiming the manual was fabricated and that you're orchestrating a smear campaign." Adrian's stomach sank. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "How much are they asking for?" $10 million, she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "They're not playing around. This isn't about the money. They want to bury you." For a moment, Adrian couldn't speak. His mind raced, each thought heavier than the last. The lawsuit wasn't just an attack on him. It was a message, a warning to anyone else who might think about standing up. But then the initial shock began to fade. replaced by a slow-burning fire. "Let them come," he said finally, his voice firm. "We'll prove the document is real. We'll fight them every step of the way." Rita exhaled sharply, a mixture of relief and admiration in the sound. "I knew you'd say that. Marcus is already working on a defense. We'll figure this out." As the days passed, the lawsuit became a new focal point for the movement. Supporters rallied around Adrian, crowdfunding for legal fees and amplifying the stories of those who had been silenced. The corporations doubled down, pouring millions into ad campaigns designed to discredit him and the growing movement. Every billboard, every slick commercial, painted a picture of trust and integrity, a stark contrast to the truths Adrian had uncovered. But then, another crack appeared. A second whistleblower emerged, this time with internal emails discussing strategies to neutralize Adrian and his allies. The emails outlined plans to smear his character, to find dirt on him, even to exploit his family's connections. One email chillingly stated, "A man like this must have skeletons, find them." When the emails were leaked to the press, the public backlash was seismic. Protests swelled to unprecedented numbers, blocking streets and filling city squares. Lawmakers who had previously been silent began calling for congressional hearings. Adrian found himself summoned to testify before a House committee, a prospect both exhilarating and terrifying. The day of the hearing, Adrian sat at the witness table, the room packed with reporters, activists, and members of Congress. Cameras flashed as he raised his hand, swearing to tell the truth. As he began his testimony, the weight of the moment settled over him, but he didn't falter. He spoke with conviction, recounting the discrimination he had faced, the systemic rot he had uncovered, and the relentless attacks he had endured. When the opposing counsel had their turn, they wasted no time trying to dismantle him. They brought up the defamation suit, questioning his motives and accusing him of profiteering from the movement. Adrian met their attacks head-on, his voice unwavering as he defended himself and the people he fought for. At one point, a particularly hostile congressman leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "Mr. Banks, what do you say to those who argue that your crusade is doing more harm than good? That your actions are costing innocent people their jobs?" Adrian straightened, his gaze steady. "I would say that those jobs were built on the backs of exploitation and discrimination," he said. "If we have to dismantle broken systems to build something better, then so be it. The cost of doing nothing is far greater." The room fell silent, his words hanging heavy in the air. Even the congressman seemed momentarily at a loss for a retort. When Adrian left the hearing, the streets outside were packed with supporters, their cheers deafening as they caught sight of him. But he couldn't bask in the moment. There was still so much to do. In the following weeks, the defamation case became the epicenter of the battle. Marcus worked around the clock, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a defense that would stand against the corporation's deep pockets and endless resources. Rita continued her relentless reporting, uncovering even more damning information about the industry's practices. And then a breakthrough. A third whistleblower stepped forward, a high-level executive who had been part of the very strategy meetings detailed in the emails. The executive brought with them not only corroboration, but more documents, evidence of systemic efforts to undermine Adrian's credibility and stifle the movement. When the trial finally began, the courtroom became a stage for a showdown unlike any other. The corporation's lawyers came out swinging, their arguments polished and ruthless. But Adrian, Marcus, and their team fought back with equal ferocity. Every witness they called, every piece of evidence they presented, chipped away at the corporation's facade. The pivotal moment came when the former executive took the stand. Their testimony was explosive, detailing how the corporation had knowingly implemented discriminatory practices and orchestrated a campaign to destroy Adrian. The courtroom was electric, the air thick with tension as the truth unraveled. By the time the trial concluded, it was clear that the tide had turned. The jury deliberated for 2 days before delivering their verdict. The defamation suit was dismissed, and the corporation was ordered to pay damages for their malicious tactics. Outside the courthouse, Adrian stood before a crowd that seemed even larger than before. His voice was hoarse, his body exhausted, but his spirit burned bright. "We've shown them what happens when we refuse to be silenced," he said, his voice carrying over the noise. But this is only the beginning. The systems that allow injustice to thrive are vast and deeply rooted. We must keep fighting, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a wave of hope and determination that surged through the streets. And as Adrian looked out at the sea of faces, he knew this was far from the end. It was a beginning, a reckoning that would continue until the world was no longer built on silence and complicity, but on justice and equality. The corporation's defeat in court sent shockwaves through the industry, rippling far beyond Adrian's initial fight. Within days of the verdict, other companies began scrambling to distance themselves from similar practices, issuing hurried statements promising reforms. The public outcry had reached a fever pitch, and the walls of silence that had protected these systems for decades were beginning to crumble. Adrian found himself thrust into an even larger spotlight, his name synonymous with resistance against injustice. But the victory, as satisfying as it was, came with a price. His every move was scrutinized, his personal life dissected by the media. Late one night, as he sat on his couch, scrolling through messages of support interspersed with vitriolic hate, he received a call from Marcus. "Adrian," Marcus said, his voice more serious than usual. "We got a problem." Adrian leaned forward, his chest tightening. "What kind of problem?" "Big money is coming for us. I just got word that a coalition of CEOs from the hospitality and service industries is pooling their resources. They're lobbying Congress to introduce legislation that could effectively neutralize everything we've been fighting for." Adrian's stomach churned. "What kind of legislation?" "They're calling it the Business Integrity Act," Marcus explained. "On paper, it's about protecting companies from false allegations and ensuring fair due process. But the language is vague enough to give them cover to suppress whistleblowers, restrict lawsuits like ours, and silence employees under the guise of protecting trade secrets." Adrian stood, pacing the room. "They're trying to rewrite the rules of the game, turn this into a legal war they can win." "That's exactly what they're doing," Marcus said. "We need to act fast. If this gains traction, it could undo everything." The next day, Adrian convened a meeting with Rita, Marcus, and the growing team of activists, lawyers, and allies who had rallied to the cause. The energy in the room was tense, but resolute. Rita took the floor first, her voice sharp and clear. "This isn't just a legal battle anymore," she said. "This is political. They're using their money and influence to rewrite the narrative, to make themselves the victims. If we're going to stop them, we need to take this fight to the public in a way that can't be ignored." Marcus nodded, adding, "We'll need testimony from employees, whistleblowers, and experts who can expose the real intent behind this legislation. But more than that, we need to mobilize people. Protests, petitions, anything that shows lawmakers the cost of siding with these corporations." Adrian listened, his jaw set as the plan began to take shape. "Then we don't wait. We start now." Within days, the movement shifted into high gear. Adrian and his team launched a massive campaign, using every tool at their disposal to raise awareness. They released videos of whistleblowers describing the retaliation they'd faced, published op-eds that tore apart the language of the proposed bill, and organized protests outside corporate headquarters and Capitol Hill. Social media became a battlefield, with hashtags like #TruthOverProfit and #StopTheSilencing trending worldwide. But the opposition was relentless. The coalition of corporations poured millions into counter-campaigns, flooding the airwaves with polished ads that framed the legislation as a necessary shield for hard-working businesses against opportunistic lawsuits. The ads painted Adrian and his allies as extremists, twisting their words and accusing them of wanting to destroy small businesses. The pressure mounted. One night, as Adrian prepared to speak at a rally, his phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering, his instincts on edge. "Mr. Banks," a deep, calm voice said. "This is William Cartwright, CEO of Silver Crest Enterprises. I believe you're familiar with my company." Adrian's breath caught. Silver Crest was one of the largest corporations backing the legislation. "What do you want?" "To offer you an opportunity," Cartwright said smoothly. "You've made your point, Mr. Banks. You've drawn attention to the flaws in the system. But this war you're waging, it's not sustainable. You're fighting against industries that fuel the economy. We're willing to discuss a compromise." Adrian's voice hardened. "Compromise? Is that what you call it when you rewrite the law to protect your profits at the expense of people's rights?" Cartwright's tone remained even, almost patronizing. "I'm offering you a chance to end this on terms that benefit both sides. We could fund your organization, give you a platform to advocate for minor reforms. But you need to drop your opposition to the legislation. Think about it. Real change takes time. This way, you could still be a hero without burning yourself out." Adrian's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles white. "You think you can buy me off? That you can slap a Band-Aid on this and call it progress while you keep the system intact?" "Be careful, Mr. Banks," Cartwright said, his voice dropping. "Heroes have a way of becoming martyrs when they don't know when to stop." The line went dead. Adrian stared at his phone, the weight of the implied threat settling over him. But instead of fear, a fire ignited in his chest. He knew now, more than ever, that this wasn't just about policies or lawsuits. It was a fight for the soul of a system that had been corrupted by greed and power. That night, as he stood before the crowd at the rally, his voice rang out with renewed determination. "They think they can buy us off, intimidate us, wear us down. But we are stronger than they realize. This fight is not just for us. It's for every worker silenced by fear, every customer treated as less than human, every community left to bear the cost of their greed. And we will not stop. Not now. Not ever." The crowd erupted, their cheers a thunderous wave of defiance. Adrian stood tall, his resolve unshaken. The battle ahead would be brutal, but he was ready. This was no longer just a movement. It was a revolution, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. The weeks that followed were a blur of chaos and determination. Protests swelled in size, spilling out into major cities, shutting down streets, and drawing international attention. The coalition of corporations doubled down on their efforts, flooding the airwaves with ads and pouring money into lobbying efforts. The Business Integrity Act hurtled through Congress, its supporters gaining ground with every backroom deal and closed-door meeting. Adrian felt the strain of the fight in every fiber of his being. Late nights spent strategizing with Marcus and Rita, early mornings addressing crowds, and the constant stream of threats that reminded him of the stakes. Then came the day of the Senate vote. The Capitol steps were packed with thousands of protesters, their chants reverberating through the air. Adrian stood at the forefront, megaphone in hand, his voice raw but unyielding as he led the crowd in a rallying cry. Rita and Marcus flanked him, their presence a steadying force in the storm. Inside the Capitol, senators debated fiercely. Adrian had spent weeks meeting with lawmakers, sharing stories from whistleblowers, victims, and employees who had suffered under the very practices this bill sought to protect. But he knew the odds were stacked against them. Money and power had a way of drowning out truth. The vote was called in the late afternoon. The crowd outside fell silent as word began to spread. Phones buzzed with updates, whispers rippling through the masses. Adrian's breath caught as Marcus handed him his phone, the screen showing the final tally. The Business Integrity Act had passed by a narrow margin. A collective gasp spread through the protesters, followed by a wave of anguished cries and shouts of frustration. Adrian's chest tightened, his mind reeling. After everything they had fought for, it still wasn't enough. The system had won, again. But as he stood there, surrounded by the raw emotion of the crowd, he realized something profound. This wasn't the end. The movement they had built wasn't just about one vote or one law. It was about a shift, a rising tide of people who refused to accept the status quo. The corporations might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. Adrian stepped forward, climbing onto a makeshift platform, his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. He raised the megaphone, and the crowd fell silent, their tear-streaked faces turning toward him. "They think they've won," he said, his voice cracking but filled with fire. "They think this vote means they've silenced us, that we'll go back to our lives and accept the injustice. But they're wrong. This is just the beginning. Look around you. Look at what we've built together. This movement is bigger than a single law, bigger than any one of us. They've exposed their hand, shown the world who they truly are, and we will not stop until we've torn their systems of oppression to the ground." The crowd erupted, their energy surging back like a tidal wave. Chants of "We are not done" and "Truth over power" filled the air, echoing off the walls of the Capitol. Over the following weeks, the movement shifted tactics. They launched boycotts targeting the corporations behind the bill, their efforts slashing profits and forcing executives into damage control. Grassroots organizers mobilized to pressure state governments, blocking similar legislation in several states. Whistleblowers continued to step forward, their stories keeping the spotlight firmly on the industry's abuses. Adrian became a symbol of resilience, his image plastered on protest signs and murals across the country. But he never let it go to his head. Every time he felt the weight of his newfound fame, he reminded himself of the faces he was fighting for, the workers, the families, the people who had been left voiceless for too long. 1 year to the day after the Senate vote, Adrian stood on a stage in the heart of New York City, addressing a crowd of hundreds of thousands. The corporations that had once seemed invincible were reeling from the relentless pressure, their reputations in tatters. Several CEOs had resigned, internal investigations had been launched, and a new wave of lawmakers, elected on platforms of justice and reform, were preparing to undo the damage caused by the Business Integrity Act. Adrian's voice rang out over the crowd, clear and resolute. This fight has been long, and it's far from over. But look at what we've accomplished together. They tried to silence us, and we became louder. They tried to break us, and we became stronger. We are unstoppable because we are united by a belief that every person deserves dignity, respect, and justice. And we will not stop. Not until we've built a world where no one is left behind. The crowd roared, their cheers a symphony of hope and defiance. Adrian stood there, the faces of the movement stretching out before him, a sea of determination and solidarity. He knew the fight would continue, that new challenges would arise, and that the forces of power and greed would never give up easily. But he also knew that they had already achieved something extraordinary. They had shown the world that change was possible, and that no matter how powerful the opposition, the truth could not be silenced. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a golden glow, Adrian felt a profound sense of peace. This was his purpose, his legacy. The fight would go on, but he would face it with the strength of millions at his back, united in a cause that was bigger than any one person. Together, they would keep pushing forward, one battle at a time, until justice prevailed.